Russell Hurn, and you're listening to Past, Present and Future, the association podcast for EMDR UK. Today, we preempt the national conference in Cardiff and bring together two of the main speakers for a masterclass session on trauma across the lifespan. I have the pleasure of welcoming Anna Gomez and Kathy Steele, who I'm sure are well known to everyone in the EMDR community for their combined work with complex PTSD, dissociation and attachment disorders. It's a pleasure to be in such esteemed company. Hello, both.
Hi, Russ.
All right. Hi, Russ.
And it's so great that we're reaching out across the world, as always, to speak with you, and looking forward to at least seeing one of you in Cardiff in the future. So the conference this year is trauma across the lifespan, which seems a really pertinent issue at the moment with all the trauma that's happening around the world for people of all ages. What do you think are the key aspects of considering trauma within a lifespan perspective, particularly for EMDR?
Well, for me, it's when working with Dolores and Anna, and again, we miss Dolores today, but she'll be with you in Cardiff, which is wonderful. But I think I've become more and more aware of the developmental differences in treating people across the lifespan. Of course, we've always been aware of children as sort of the special category and then adolescence, but I think I've become more aware and attuned to the work with younger adults versus middle age versus the elderly. So I think although trauma treatment has a lot of similarities, there are certainly some differences there, and also, modifications in some of our approaches.
And I think that for our clinicians, I think looking at a wide perspective of how trauma and dissociation present themselves is an incredible gain and an incredible gift. And to understand, like Kathy was saying, that there are significant differences, but also a lot of similarities. Specifically for children, understanding that certainly children may present with symptoms that may be reminiscent or similar to what adults presents with. But in some other cases, they may be very different. And so also looking at children not as little adults, but really recognizing the developmental needs that they have, the developmental differences. And even when it comes to theory, clinical applications, there are differences when we work with kids, how we conceptualize the case, how we organize the treatment through the 8 phases. There are significant differences.
Do you think there are times within the lifespan that increases our vulnerability to trauma and may therefore kind of impact on the way that we can use EMDR?
I think definitely there are developmental periods for individuals in particular who are more vulnerable. And I'm thinking, for example, mothers with very young children tend to be more vulnerable, and their time is torn, and they're really focused on protecting others. And so it's quite hard for them to get into their own inner experience. And yet that's so important for the secure attachment to develop with the children. I'm thinking about that group, and I'm thinking about the elderly who we know are more vulnerable in general because of more cognitive decline and a little bit less resilience. I think about the rubber band still can stretch in terms of resilience, but it's a little bit old, and an old rubber band sometimes can snap more easily. And it's really weird talking about the elderly because I'm now in that group of over 65 and I don't feel any different, but I think it is true that as we age, we become less physically, less emotionally, in some ways, stretchy. And sometimes we lose some of the external supports that we have had with aging. And so those are two particular vulnerabilities I think of in adults. And in terms of altering our approaches, one of the things that I've been quite aware of, and we'll talk about this in my talk in Cardiff, is that the elderly have a very short future. And so doing a lot of future orientation approaches may not be as helpful for them as to stay very much in the present moment. So just little things that are different.
Well, and when it comes to children, and imagine children are resilient, but children are incredibly vulnerable. And they're also going through critical periods of development. So the circuitry in the brain that is in charge of regulatory processes are not well developed yet. And in fact, they develop as a result of having repetitive experiences with their caregivers, with that external regulator. And through those experiences of being with a parent that is able to soothe the child, then eventually the child is able to participate in his or her own regulatory processes. So it's able to modulate arousal. And so imagine how vulnerable children are, especially, the first 2 years of life are incredibly vulnerable. Also, when you think about pre-adolescence, that's a critical developmental stage as well. There are massive changes in the brain and the neurobiology of the adolescent. And so, of course, that in themselves make them, children and adolescents, pre-adolescents, more vulnerable to experiences of trauma.
So I was just picking up on Kathy's phrase there, stretchy. And I was thinking, so being cognitively, emotionally, maybe even physically stretchy, does that mean we've got greater access to our adaptive information network?
I think that's what I meant. Yeah, that we are resilient. We can adapt to what is, which means we have to, maybe flexibility is a better word than stretchy, but
I like stretchy. Let's go with stretchy.
The rubber band. With the flexibility and the, being quick on your feet, so to speak, to be able to adapt to what is with adaptive information. I mean, I think that is part of what we're trying to help our clients with, not only access adaptive information that they have trouble accessing, but actually helping them develop it in the first place because they simply don't have it.
Yeah. And Anna, you were mentioning kind of 2 points of vulnerability, the teenagers and the really young children. And I was thinking, I hear many people say to me, oh, it's all right, she was too young to know.
Yeah. I hear that all the time. And even from parents, right? Sometimes they feel like, let's don't address trauma because they don't even know it happened. So there is this idea, in our society, that if you experience trauma early in your life, then you don't have access to it. And it's the opposite. It really impacts the neurobiology of the child even more than if the trauma takes place when we're adults. So this is children don't have a well-developed personality structure, and the whole biology is just developing. So the impact, in fact, is greater. In addition to that, people think that cognitive or the memory that has cognitive elements is the only form of memory. But the experience is in the embodied mind of the child, still there.
Yeah. So for them, they may have great access to the trauma, but they haven't got the access necessarily to the resources, to that attachment, that security that maybe would help them to overcome it.
Yeah. Well, and some of them, if we look at adaptive network for a lot of children with chronic developmental trauma, these are children that don't have a well-developed adaptive network. So they didn't have the experiences that allow them to develop the synaptic connection, the synaptic architecture that holds the adaptive information. They didn't have experience of security or safety, connection, synchronicity, shared coherence with their parents, and regulation. So these are children that, quite often, even during initial phases of treatment, we have to work on building the adaptive network because they just don't have it. So many times with this population, I tried to get a safe place and they couldn't find it. because they never had experiences of safety.
Mm.
Or if they found a safe place, it was a safe place with a lot of distortions. Like, I'm in a monster house. I remember a child said that to me. They're scary. That's my safe place. Or I'm on a roller coaster going down. That's my safe place. So they don't have a good sense of what safe feels like. And so we have to start by restoring that safety and giving their own biology the opportunity to experience what it is to feel safe.
I was thinking, sorry, you're going to add something, Kathy?
Well, I was just wanting to play off that a little bit and thinking about adults, again, across the lifespan, that often these children and adolescents who are traumatized because they don't have the adaptive capacities and the information, they end up being re-traumatized over time. It's called the sitting duck syndrome. And the more they're re-traumatized, the less, of course, they can build this concept of safety. And so you can get to someone who's, say, in their 40s, and they say, I don't know what you mean by safe. Or their safe place is something with like 43 locks and bars. And you can tell they're just trying to keep the lack of safety outside of this tiny, tiny little place, but it's about to intrude at any minute. So what you're saying, Anna, it also holds for adults, perhaps even more so.
So I was thinking of the contrast with the very young children, obviously developing their resources, their resilience within that attachment environment. For the older people, Kathy, you were mentioning maybe a restriction in that ability, that stretchiness. But then we've got those teenagers who are developing into an adult mind and everything is changing for them. I mean, that must be a really difficult period.
Oh, it is a difficult period. And we know that there are massive changes in the brain. There is a massive death of neurons. I mean, the brain is preparing to become an adult brain. And this is why we see that a lot of disorders, significantly increase during adolescence. We see a significant increase in depression, anxiety, because of the hormonal changes, the changes that are happening in the neurobiology of the adolescent. And so, is an adolescent that's starting to test the boundaries, that is starting to, come closer to that, who I am in the world, right? And because they already have, here's the thing with adolescence and trauma. So the way I see trauma is a growth inhibiting experience if it's not treated and worked through, because these are children that say they're traumatized, and they have to allocate all their resources to survival. So they use all their energy for survival. So they don't have the time and energy to grow. The counterparts, the children that didn't experience trauma, they are developing. They are developing more sophisticated ways of regulating themselves, relating to other people. So by the time they reach adolescence, the child that was traumatized now as a pre-adolescent is still using very primitive regulatory strategies. Is an adolescent that is really behind, because the adolescent had to use all the energy for survival, not for growth. And so they're already behind. And so they rely on primitive ways of relating to the world, relating to others, and relating to themselves, and very primitive ways of regulating arousal.
Yeah, and I think that need for growth never stops, right? We're not talking about physical growth, but we're talking about developmental growth. And even adults, there are developmental stages that we need to achieve over time. Greater maturity, greater ability to take perspective, a more cohesive sense of self across time and context. You're consolidating your whole life. All of that is really important in adults. And so if you start with, as we do with our clients, where they have been already stunted in some way in their growth in childhood and adolescence, then they're playing catch up the rest of their lives. And some of them don't even enter into therapy until later in their adult life. And so they have so much catch up to do. And this is one of the reasons why I focus a lot on stabilization, not necessarily as a means to work through the traumatic memory, but as a very much huge part of the therapy process to help people grow in their development in the places where they're stunted. I think we sometimes think of stabilization as too small. I think of it as developmental achievements that we need to help our clients achieve. And that in itself will provide a more stable ground for traumatic memory processing.
With that in mind, I was thinking if trauma is stunting our growth, arresting our development, how important do you think it is to use or to have child training if you're working with an adult trauma that might not be processed until, many, many years after the child experience?
Yeah, I really want to answer this because I'm a strictly adult therapist. And I've never had a lot of training in children. And then I met Anna and started working with her. And I have learned an incredible amount, not just about children, but about my own clients, because my clients have been children. And I think it's giving me much more of a developmental foundation to prepare interventions and approaches to my adult clients, because now I have those links. I mean, I've had those vague links in some way, but now I feel like it's really a solid pathway to understand from birth to the point where my client is, what do we need to do actually in addition to processing the trauma, because it's a much bigger issue than just processing the trauma. So it's been incredibly helpful for me, a strictly adult therapist, to learn about child therapy.
Anna, did you? Yeah.
Well, and for me,
thank you, Anna.
Yeah, and for me to work with Dolores and Kathy, it's just been enlightening, really, because then we get to see the full picture of what the children that I'm working with where they could end up, And so when you look at the entire clinical landscape, it really gives you a greater capacity for case conceptualization, for truly understanding that the overall clinical landscape, and aids you in that decision-making process that you go through over and over during the therapeutic, work. So for me, it really has changed me to see the overall picture. So I'm so grateful for Kathy and for Dolores because of what they have brought into my, my therapeutic box.
So when working with children, what we've got is the future adult. And when working with the adults, what we have is the traumatized child in many cases. So I was thinking at the moment, with so much trauma going on in Eastern Europe, we have parents and children who are being traumatized together. What impact do you think that has on their individual experiences of those events?
So, is that okay, Kathy? You want to answer?
I'll allow
or you. Want
you.
Me to? Okay. Yeah. So
you're so polite, you two.
I do believe that working systemically and looking at complex trauma and dissociation from a systemic EMDR perspective is important, because quite often what we have is not just a traumatized child, but we have a traumatized system. Quite often I work with traumatized families and a parent, also a caregiving system that is not functioning well because of trauma. It's a caregiving system that is either in constant state of mobilization mediated by the sympathetic system, or is a parent that is in shutdown, hyperaroused. And that in itself, can induce some trauma and adversity because of the relationship, we think for a moment, not even thinking about Ukraine, because Ukraine is a very clear overt trauma that is happening. It's happening to the child, it's happening to the parent, it's happening to the system, it's happening to the society, it's happening to the world. Even us from far away, when we listen to that, I was watching on Facebook a child asking what is happening as the child is watching the news. And the child sees other children and families and parents dying and being wounded. So really it's trauma that the world is enduring. But going back to the systemic elements of treatment, when we're working with a traumatized system, we need to also work systemically. And it is possible with EMDR to do really good systemic work when we work on rebuilding the caregiving system. If we're going to work with children with complex trauma and dissociation, we have to remember that the child still relies on the parent for co-regulation. And if the parent is not regulated because of trauma, it's either shut down, emotionally unavailable, or is in constant state of hyperarousal, this is a child that is not going to feel safe. So asking them to think about a safe place will do very little because they don't feel safe in their relationship with the parents. So they find safety in their relationship with the parents. So if the parent has unresolved trauma, and as a result of that is not able to connect, co-regulate, then preparation phase is going to be dedicated to restoring that shared coherence, that homeostasis, not only individually, but dyadically and systemically.
Kathy?
Yeah, and I want to address another piece of it. My mind is going in two directions, so I have to choose one. But the first one is that I think collective trauma can play out a little bit differently than trauma that is done individually and in secret. Right? With collective trauma, you have people around you supporting you, agreeing on what had happened. There's not this issue of disbelief, of trying to keep it secret. There is an outpouring of support. And so there is this resilience factor built into collective kinds of trauma if you can access it. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. But I think the other one is that there are all kinds of collective traumas happening, systemic traumas other than war. There's poverty, there's racism, there are all of these kinds of oppressive experiences that people experience collectively. And many of those are we're less able to recognize and talk about in the same way that we can talk about war, because war is so visual in some ways, but these others we have with us always, and they become these sort of silent, almost secretive experiences that I think parents and children are enduring. And I'm just thinking about my clients who grew up in abject poverty and the kind of chronic, crushing shame that they experience because of that poverty, and they can hardly articulate it. Whereas in war, I think there are so many visuals and so many narratives. I know narrative is not always easy to articulate even with those things, but you have this collective support in some way to talk about them. And so, and it also, the third piece is the individual vulnerabilities that people have when they experience these. Some people will be more resilient, some parents and children, and others will have already been traumatized, say, before the war, and will have more difficulty then. So we're looking at a lot of different social, cultural, and individual factors that play into each individual case. And I think those are all important to look at in our case conceptualizations.
Just following on from that, Kathy, I was thinking, how important do you think it is to be culturally aware when embarking on EMDR?
Well, embarking on any therapy, I wouldn't limit it to EMDR, but any therapy, we need to understand the context and the belief systems of the client. And I'm thinking about cases in which the way I think about how, adolescents and young adults should separate and individuate from their parents, and how different that is in other countries from the United States. It's just one small thing. Or how people grieve, whether they grieve overtly or internally without any shown emotion. I think we have to be not too quick to assess that and pathologize it before we really understand the whole culture around what it means to be traumatized. How do you talk about it? How do you experience your emotions? And how do you connect to other people?
Anna?
Yeah, well, and I'm so glad, Kathy, you brought up issues of marginalization, for instance, because in any approach, but specifically here, EMDR therapy, we really need to explore experiences connected to race, ethnicity, gender, for instance. I mean, how is it for a child that has already been impacted by trauma to, in addition to that, be marginalized because of the color of his or her skin? I would never forget a child that will use an eraser to make his skin lighter, for instance. And so the color of your skin is not something you can escape from. So for him, the color of his skin was something that was bad, right? And that led to shame, to the feeling of not being good enough. And not only that, but to feel that he was damaged. That's what he used to report to me. And so we do need to look at the context, like Kathy was saying. It's like, what is that? The racial, the ethnic, the cultural, the gender, the beliefs around that, the experiences around it. And they become really important targets for not only develop resources around that, but to process eventually, right? Because it is ongoing trauma. It is collective and ongoing trauma. And so how we're going to honor in that context throughout the 8 phases of EMDR treatment, that's something for us, right? EMDR clinicians to really, really think about and honor it throughout the 8 phases.
I agree. And I think there was something that Kathy was saying about understanding the meaning of trauma within that culture.
Mm-hmm.
Because the words we often use in the 8 phases of EMDR are very kind of Western driven. And I think sometimes we have to translate that, or at least have a way of understanding what we need to say or how we need to ask questions to connect people to the trauma and truly understand what they've been through.
And also, how do they conceptualize healing? So how do they see the healing process? Because we may see it in a very linear way, and they have their own ways of healing. And so how we can honor and incorporate some of the rituals, some of the things that they do in the process of healing within the 8 phases. So how can we speak their language and honor their belief system?
Well, I was just thinking about speaking the client's language. And I think as I've gotten older, hopefully wiser, I've stopped using theoretical terms with my clients and really are saying, what would you call that? How would you describe that? And I try to use their own language. It's called experience near language. So you enter into the experience of the client by using their language rather than asking them to accommodate to your language. Because we have sometimes when I read even my own writing, I go, oh my gosh, this is so jargony. And I think that jargon is not, for a few clients, they like it. But for most clients, we want to enter into their world, keep one foot in our world, but put the other foot in their world with their language, with their conceptualizations, and not try to shift them too much into the boxes that we have created to help ourselves feel comfortable and to help ourselves understand theory. What I've really found is that there is a gap between theory and humanity, and that no theory, not even my faves, will hold all of humanity. And so I have to be willing to step out of my comfort zone, I think, and give up all the techniques and approaches sometimes to find a way to be with the person in front of me that connects for them. And I'm not saying in any way we should give up our theories, which are dearly held for me, or our approaches, our techniques, but to be more flexible with our clients, with our languages.
Yeah. And I will add that, so it's about having the theory support us but not constrict us, and letting the
That's nice. Yeah.
That's what we do with children, in play. When we're playing in play therapy, we never assume that even when the child is pointing to a dog that is clearly a dog, I don't even assume that's a dog. I always ask, but tell me what that is. And sometimes they will say a monster, right? So I don't know what that is for the child. And so that's part of the work with our children, is never to assume, and allow the child to show us, take us where you need us to go, right? And to be able to do that, we hold the theory, we hold the techniques, but we also open our minds and our hearts and our bodies just to feel what's emerging in the moment, right? And that intersubjective field, without us having to interpret or without us having to label it, but just giving the freedom to the child to show us, this is the version of myself, right? And so when we are the one labeling or naming,
which means that we have to be
hear the story from the child.
And stay curious and listen for what is not being said or what's underneath. And one of the things that, one of the examples I think of is a client who came to me, and she said her doctor said she was so depressed she couldn't get out of bed. And so I just said, well, what happens in bed? What do you do all day? And what she ended up saying is, I'm terrified. I hear this voice calling for mommy, and I become paralyzed. She wasn't depressed. She was having dissociative experiences. Now, we're all familiar with that, but the assumption that because she couldn't get out of bed, she was depressed was a very common assumption that we would make. And I think just being curious about what takes you to bed, what do you do when you're in bed, what makes it hard to get out of bed, those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking around symptoms that I think give us so much more information before we just jump to, well, it's this thing because that feels familiar.
Thinking of that example then, Kathy, do either of you have other examples where we can really kind of understand the nuances of working across the lifespan and the differences that entails?
Well, I'm thinking about working, partly because this is what I'm going to be talking about, working with the elderly. And when do we really want to process trauma with the truly elderly, right? And when do we want to contain and offer resourcing and stabilization? And I'm just thinking about a case which happened many years ago, because now most of the child Holocaust survivors are dead or in the process of dying. But at this time, I had a case of a man who was about 75, and he had been hospitalized for depression after the death of his wife. And we often know that trauma can emerge when there's a significant loss, a significant developmental impact of life experience. And so he had been hospitalized for the first time in his life. And he began to describe, just in the course of his history, that his mother had been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, and he didn't know why. but before World War II. And he had been a very young adolescent in World War II. And he had been deported to a camp. It wasn't one of the death camps, but nevertheless, he was separated from his mother. And he had some really difficult experiences there. And he said, it's like it's this cliff in my mind full of little caves. And the caves have coverings on them. And I have learned to live with those coverings and those caves. And what I really want to be able to do is to go on with my life and let those caves be there. I accept them as they are, but I don't want to open up each individual one because I'm not going to be able to cope. And so I said, okay, and began to work with him on grieving his wife, which I think was a way of grieving a lot in his childhood. But we stayed away from the specifics of those caves. We talked about the generalities. And he got back on his feet. And 3 years later, he married again. He did well. And he did really well until his death. So I think that was a great learning experience for me, not to insist on got to open up those caves or you're not going to be able to be okay. It wasn't true for him. And he only had a limited amount of time to live, and he wanted to make the most of it as he could. So it's a great example in my book.
Thank you, Kathy. That's lovely. I know I was just wondering, for youngsters, for little ones, those caves are very dark and scary. They don't want to open those up either.
Yeah, well, and when it comes to children, dissociation may be seen in so many different ways, because some children may show a clear dissociative structure and you may see parts, but for some children, you're going to see more of kind of trance-like states, or a child that just staring out in space, or a child that reenacts, a lot of reenactment. So I'm going to be showing during my presentation some pictures, where the child creates in the sand tray stories that what you see really is some parts that are starting to form, or the alliance to the perpetrator may show up in play state, or may show up in the sand tray, may show up in, puppet show, for instance, because children have very unique ways, developmentally actually appropriate ways of telling their stories. They're not going to give us a clear narrative of what's happening, or the parts may not show up just like adults do. But instead, they may have reenactments. I'm going to be showing some pictures. For instance, this little girl is drawing a picture of her and her mom, and suddenly scribbles like really, hard with, a dark marker. And I'm curious. Now, curiosity, as Kathy was saying, I become really curious about what happened. Well, it turned out to be a part that showed up that was incredibly angry because she was drawing a picture of her and mom. She was very angry at mom. And so see how parts sometimes show up in a kind of a different way. And sometimes they reenact in play states, free play, non-directed play, or the sand tray. And so it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. After all the years I've dedicated to working with this population, it's fascinating how the young mind can tell the story in so many different ways. So at this point, I always assume that the story is telling itself. I just need to be open to see the story, how they reenact it, and even in how they relate to me. I had a little girl that will come to my office. She was abused at home, but also they had to go to a domestic violence shelter, and she was abused there, and no one found her. And so she will come in to the office and she will hide. That's all she wanted to do. She wanted to hide, and she wanted me to find her. So she wanted to be found, right? So I did for several sessions, you know what I did? I just found her. She will hide and I will find her. I will say, I found you. Now I know where you are. And she was so happy. And after following her, I really got it. I said to myself, she wanted to be found. She wanted someone to come in and find her. I'm here and rescue her, right? Some parents may think that, oh, you know, this is a waste of time. I'm bringing my child to therapy and all you do is she hides, you find her. She hides, you find her.
Yeah, we could have done that at home.
Exactly. But it was so therapeutic for this child to be found. And so these urges will show up if we're able to see them and follow the child. You know, that's how they're telling you the story. And if we keep our minds open, our hearts open, our bodies open to feel what's emerging, we will see the story emerging.
See, and witness, I would suggest as well. And that's really important that you hold that space. Mm-hmm. Kathy, I was just wondering, you heard the lovely example of Anna with her play and young children. Is there room for play when working with adults?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about playing with child dissociative parts on the floor, but playfulness. Yeah. And kind of play with words and those kinds of use of humor. All of that is very, very important. In the use of imagery, we can play with imagery. So all of that is very important as well with adults. And I'm also thinking the enactments happen all the time with adults. If we just rise above the whole picture and look at it and meta observe, we can see the story being told in all of their relationships and often in their relationship with us. And if we can get out of the weeds and really look, the story is always right there. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, always finding the story.
Mm-hmm.
I could talk to you two for hours, and I'm aware that we don't really have that time. Well, I probably could find it, but we have to wrap things up. And really, this was a bit of a taster for the excitement to come at the conference. And I really think from hearing the stories and the things you've said today, people are going to be very interested in attending your workshops. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And is with just such pleasure that I say thank you for your contributions today, for being with us and sharing this time. So thank you. We look forward to seeing you soon at the conference and for hearing more about you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Russ.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Past, Present and Future is a Laura Beach production for EMDR UK.